According to the Global Slavery Index, Myanmar and Cambodia rank among the 10 worst countries in the world for human trafficking and modern-day slavery.
That 120,000 people were trapped in scam centers in Myanmar.
These victims of human trafficking are forced to execute cryptocurrency fraud.
If this is your first time listening to our podcast, welcome. Our programming brings a diversity of voices connected to Myanmar to share their perspectives, thoughts, and reflections about what has been happening there since the military coup in 2021. All of our guests share one thing in common: a deep personal stake in the ongoing crisis. And it is an honor for us to be able to bring their voices into your earbuds. But however difficult it may be to hear some of their stories, we hope that you will come away with a deeper and more nuanced understanding of what is happening there.
And welcome back. Today I'm joined by Catherine, and we're going to be looking at Hagar, which is an organization that works against human trafficking and various types of abuse, whose work includes quite a lot of countries in the broader Southeast Asian region, and specifically among them Myanmar. But before we get into the details of that, Catherine, thank you very much for sharing your time and your experience with us today, and I'd like to give you the chance to introduce yourself a little bit more fully for our audience.
Great. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to speak about the work and be able to talk to you about our shared insights into Myanmar. My name is Catherine Kirkendall. I am the executive director of the U.S. office for Hagar. Hagar is an international NGO that was founded in Cambodia back in 1994. And over the last 30 years, we've expanded our work into Afghanistan, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, with work in Myanmar and the Solomon Islands. So a lot of Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. We work with survivors of human trafficking and other forms of extreme abuse doing holistic care. So trauma-informed care, counseling, case management, the wraparound services that a person needs when they are extracted from that sort of situation until they can be reintegrated into society. We do prevention and we also do protection. We do some rescue, but we are focused mainly on that sort of restoration section of once a survivor is pulled out until they go back into their home or wherever is safest.
And so let's look at Cambodia, because it's a place that I think some people might know, some people might not know. Why would it be so significant? Why would it be so important for an organization like this that's targeting, human trafficking and slavery, sexual exploitation, and things of that nature, to operate in a country like Cambodia, particularly a country like Cambodia 10 years ago, slightly more than 10 years ago? Can you describe for us what the situation on the ground was like at that time?
Yeah. So when Hagar started in 1994, it was right after the Khmer Rouge, when the UN forces were in Cambodia and Phnom Penh, keeping the peace. So there was still fighting. There was no infrastructure. All of the elite had been killed and it was sort of this rebirth. So there were women and children on the streets, and it started with a woman who had been abused by her employer and had a baby, and sort of grew organically from people knowing that this person was helping, and then realizing there was a need for to actually make this into an NGO. And then from there, it grew into just seeing where the need was and then starting to do research into where there were needs and where the skills that Hagar could provide would be best utilized. But Cambodia 30 years ago was, some people say, sort of like the Wild West. It was a place of complete rebirth and trying to figure out what even any sort of care could look like. So it was definitely full need, and we've stayed there. It's been our flagship, but also we've helped the communities. We've also helped the government in things like moving from shelter-based care to foster care and coming up with what do laws look like there, because we have that sort of long stretch of 30 years there. We have the ability to sort of feed into more innovative ways of working in Cambodia, which is why we stay.
Absolutely. And I think Cambodia is the stories that we get from Cambodia. My understanding was that this is significantly less so the case today, partially because of work like Hagar's work and other advocacy groups, but that previously was so bad that orphanages, quote unquote orphanages, which don't operate as we understand them as places just for children with no parents, but also for children whose parents are too poor to support them in rural areas, need to make money, and so they open their doors to tourists who, can come along and have their little Instagram opportunity to teach, poor children or whatever. And the way I've had it described to me is that it's this cycle of psychological abuse where the children are deliberately neglected so that they are more dependent on those tourists, so that the tourists have a more gratifying experience. And then that bleeds over into other forms of exploitation of children. And then that bleeds over into a business model where children are even abducted by these facilities in order to ensure that there are enough children to bring in investment from tourists and less savory people. Would that be an accurate representation of what was happening in Cambodia back in the day?
Yeah, when I first went over, lived in Cambodia back in 2012, there were signs everywhere that children are not zoo. It's not an attraction. It had kind of kids behind bars looking like it was in a zoo. And that it was starting to be a conversation of the fact that this was a big problem that was being cracked down on. And that was just 2012. So 12 years ago, it was a huge issue of shelters that were there for real need, but then orphanages being a place where people from rural communities would be able to send their children to get schooling, and be able to have someone else feed their kids, and with the hope that their child would come back. And it's that whole feeling of, it's the same thing that happens with kids that get trafficked by parents, where the need is so great because the poverty is so high that oftentimes you just turn a blind eye to all of those red flags, all of the things that should stop you from doing that sort of thing, and hope that it's okay. And then there were many orphanages that were shut down forcibly by the government, and others that needed to be and weren't until the government decided that orphanages should no longer be in existence. That doesn't mean that there aren't some still there, but it's far less of a tourist attraction, because I think that the world has started to understand that you're not seeing real need, or you're seeing need that has been created, and that's almost worse than the sort of abuse that a child may have been experiencing, to go from one place that may not have been safe, or at least was a vulnerable place to live, into what very clearly could be argued to be a more vulnerable place. And it's definite need, and it was an issue there, and continues to be an issue in some other places in Southeast Asia.
Mm. And so then the question comes for an organization like yours, what sort of response or reaction do you get from governments? Because on the one hand, notionally, of course, governments would want to crack down on abuse. They would want to crack down on these things, even if, let's say, these sectors are bringing some money into the economy. They don't want to be known as, being complicit in abuse. But an organization like yours would also raise awareness of the fact that these unsavory things are happening, and that might be seen as bad PR for the state. So what sort of negotiation interaction do you have with governments on that end?
That's a great question. I think because we started in Cambodia, so we weren't an outside international NGO coming into Cambodia. It sort of was organic. We were always looking on the forefront of what is best practice and what do we see as sort of the next step. So years before it was adopted, we brought forward to the government that, kinship care, children living with a family member or in community, was the best practice. We had researchers look into it of what that could look like. And so it's sort of bringing to them this research of, this is something that you should know, and then saying, we'd like to start this. We'd like to do sort of a foster care test case and see what that looks like, which gives the government a space of being able to look good in the area, by saying that they're, innovative in doing foster care. And then when that works, and actually it's working very well, then there's that continued conversation. So in Cambodia, I mean, I say that in 30 seconds, but it was years of work to get to that point. And then you've got other areas where, in some of the other countries where we work, where it's a more nuanced conversation, but it is still that conversation of, look, you can be innovative in this field, and it makes you look better in Southeast Asia, and when you go to the ASEAN conferences, to be able to say these things. And so that sort of outweighs the income that might come from an orphanage, because there's plenty of other income that they can direct their attention to as well.
It's kind of interesting how even something as self-evidently important as preventing trafficking has to be wrapped in a very PR-friendly sort of packaging to be palatable to the state. I don't know. I don't know what that tells us about governments in general, but it's kind of unfortunate.
It is interesting. It is. I am thankful that all of the countries that we work in now at least acknowledge that trafficking happens, and acknowledge that trafficking is a problem in their country. That's not always been the case, but it does take time, and it takes someone within the government being willing to be self-reflective in order to say that as well, which can be hard in the culture as well.
I mean, do they? I wonder whether they find a way to push it off, because I remember talking to a friend of mine, and she traveled through Southeast Asia, and she'd worked in sort of restorative justice, and she was saying that in a lot of Southeast Asia, disability is often viewed very negatively. People who are disabled are viewed as either victims of their own bad karma from a previous life, or just as a burden and all that stuff. And what she said, the interesting difference was when she was in Vietnam, so much disability existed as a result of the American use of Agent Orange and Agent Green that even completely unrelated disabilities could sort of be put into that bucket of, oh, this is the fault of the Americans. And because there was a sense that it was a bad external distant force that had caused it, it was somehow not as shameful to the government and to the community to say, no, we will step in and we will address this. As long as you can shift blame to someone who's not you, you can look good in trying to address it. And I'm wondering whether these governments are trying to tackle these problems like trafficking and slavery and child exploitation and try to spin it so that these problems are fundamentally external problems that the government is heroically trying to handle internally.
It's such an interesting. I hadn't heard that about the Agent Orange, and that makes so much sense. You know, in Vietnam, it's very easy for the government to say we're working with trafficking because so many women are trafficked into China as brides. And I mean, it's sort of a human thing to want to shift blame and be able to work on something because it's been an external force brought upon yourself. It's just a lot easier than it is to turn inward and see something as being something you might need to work on internally as a nation or as a human. So that makes a lot of sense there. I do see that in our work with governments, in our work with in countries, and even in communities. We do a lot of work with prevention in communities and talking to the communities that are very vulnerable, where we see high instances of trafficking and abuse. And oftentimes it's showing the community what is trafficking, showing the community what is abuse, and being able to talk about it in this way of, you didn't know because you didn't know this before, because nobody ever shared it with you. So it almost shifts the blame to someone for never telling them that. So then you can accept, okay, well, now we know, so now we can work on it. And it's interesting you mentioned disabilities. Hagar used to work very closely in Cambodia. We had a home for children and adults with disabilities, and we did trainings and then job placements. And there are multiple different NGOs that do that now. So we've sort of handed that piece of it off. But it was for years something that, exactly like you said, there was such stigma against it. And that sort of mindset has shifted in Cambodia and in Vietnam a little bit to understand. But also we see in some of our survivors that we've had come through Hagar in Cambodia specifically, where a trafficker would have taken a child and caused a disability, maimed the child so that they could beg and get more money. And so that once that became known and went through the court system a few times, I do think that changed some perception as well, that some of the people you see with disabilities are not born with that disability, but had been caused to them. They'd been harmed in a way by someone who had taken them to try to get monetary gain from that abuse.
I mean, that is severe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the concept, it's something that people are familiar with as a concept in the West through largely the movie Slumdog Millionaire.
Mm-hmm.
There's that scene where they blind a child so he makes more money begging as a singer. But it's just kind of appalling to hear that that's not, a Hollywood, evil fantasy. That is a real thing. That is really happening. It's kind of sickening to know that, and the depths that people are willing to sink to in order to make money. as well. But I want to circle back here because see, this I find very interesting when you talk about explaining to communities what constitutes abuse. That's strange to me, and shamefully, I have to admit, I'm not as up on the history of women's emancipation in the West as I should be. But I would imagine that if you went to, say, a man in a patriarchal society and you said, "Hey, beating your wife constitutes abuse, marital rape constitutes abuse," my imagination is that the response would very much be, well, who are you to come into my community and tell me how to run, my marriage? My community slash culture slash community leaders slash religion slash what have you has given me authority and dominance over my wife, over my marriage. It is not your place to question that. And I would presume that somebody would bristle at the idea that they're being told that what they do is an unacceptable thing to do, and would push back. And it seems to be that you're saying that no, they're receptive to this information that the status quo is not acceptable, that their current behavior is not acceptable, and they're willing to change. So what has your experience been with that?
Yeah, that's I would have the same initial reaction that you do as well. And I think it's really interesting. We have phenomenal workers on the ground. Our staff in each country is a fully national staff, and so they understand the cultural nuances of where they're working and have adapted this like 16 part program in each of the countries. And the way that it works is there are women groups and men groups in these vulnerable communities that are separated out, and the women meet separately and the men meet separately, and they talk through a whole host of different things. But interlaced in all of it is this conversation about what is abuse and what to look for. But it's kind of woven into also working with the women on economic empowerment. So there are these small grants that are given to start a business. And so what we end up seeing is that it's not maybe necessarily that men understand at first that beating your wife is abuse, but seeing that not beating your wife and then your wife going out and making money for the family is then gives her more power to then say, I won't let you treat me this way. And she has more voice because of that. So it's sort of this like multi-pronged approach. And then we find from conversations and from the research that we do from the baseline to the end of this 16-week program, that the men will then see that, okay, well, not abusing has actually proven beneficial for me. And therefore I now think that it's a bad idea to beat your wife. And so it's kind of hard to say if altruistically or morally the person has changed their mind, or is it because they see that not doing it has better outcomes. But I do think it's the separating them out and having this robust conversation and then seeing the good come out of the community from these conversations. But it really works because the women then have more voice when when they're bringing funds into the family. So it's sort of a both and.
I mean, yeah, from your perspective, from the advocacy perspective, I would say obviously it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter whether the motivation is altruistic, whether the motivation is religious, whether the motivation is financial, what have you. As long as you get the correct outcome. But it's still a bit of an indictment, I think, when fundamental moral precepts have to be presented as financial benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, there's this long arc. So in Cambodia, there used to be this saying that boys are steel or metal and girls are white cloth. And so the thinking was that, in Cambodia, nothing stays clean for very long. And so if a girl is white cloth, as soon as she's dropped on the ground or, has been abused, she's now dirty. Um, and and similarly, the conversation of boys being able to be abused was very difficult because if boys are steel or metal, then they're tough and will just like buff up and carry on. And it has taken, more than a decade, but that thinking has shifted with the newer generation as they're getting older, the adults now recognizing the worth of a girl um, intrinsically, and that men and boys can be abused. But it's just been this long conversation of seeing, of starting with seeing women that had been abused actually having jobs and living full lives, and then long years of that, then understanding that abuse didn't mean that a woman was no longer valuable to the community. And so now I think a person in Cambodia wouldn't tell you that same saying anymore. So I think the longer hope is that that would be the same as what happens in these communities of men and women with abuse within the family as well.
Yeah, because I mean, this is the thing, right? When you have a culture that views women as taintable, right? Like, and we have this, like, particularly when it comes to rape, there's the fetishization of women's virginity, which persists even in the West. It creates the situation where, number one, you you don't distinguish between consensual sex and rape. You don't make a distinction. The virginity has been lost. That's one huge cultural element. And then as a result of that, you then have this situation where if you divide all women into virgins and non-virgins, and you say that virgins are intrinsically more valuable, the pressure is put on women to stay silent about the abuse that they receive, because the long-term societal ramifications, particularly in a society where as a woman you might wind up in middle of your life, later in life, economically dependent on men and economically dependent on your husband's family, the ramifications of that abuse might be worse than the abuse itself. And so it's very difficult to come forward. It's very difficult to say anything. And my understanding is Cambodia has traditionally been a somewhat conservative and sexually conservative culture. So I imagine that this would have been a particular issue that comes up.
100%. That is, when I first was working with Hagar in Cambodia, that was one of the big things that was happening. And the reason why the age of trafficking, the age of rape and abuse got younger and younger, because unfortunately, people who were trying to purchase a virgin were wanting to make sure. Um, and and also a virgin would be so much higher price, um, and so horrific. And then when it's rape that happens within the family or within a community, you're also, for multiple different reasons, sometimes it's a person who's come into the community, has groomed the community and done something great like building a road or building a school, and so there's the fear of saying it just because you don't want the community to not reap the benefits of this person anymore, but also because of what will happen to your down the line marriage prospects when people know that you are no longer pure, in quotation marks. And I think that has been, and Cambodia still is a conservative place, and it still does happen. There's so much more understanding around it, but it does make coming forward a bold and courageous choice, which, and that's part of the reason why we do a lot of outreach into communities and in schools to have conversations about what to look for, what are signs of abuse, what to say, so that community members can then start to, if they see something, they could bring that up, so that it's not always the person who's been abused having to start that conversation. So, we'll now have people call our hotline and say that they think something might be happening. Then we, or a partner organization or the government, can look into that and investigate it, which can be helpful. It's as always, it's a work in progress. And the work that is never actually over, we just get further down the line.
Another thing that you mentioned as well that I found very important is that you're also talking about normalizing the idea that men can also be victims. And I think that's, the very patriarchal distinction between men and women, and the characterization of women as inherently weak and soft, cuts both ways, because it also implies on the other end, as you say, that men don't face abuse. Men just face adversity, that makes them stronger in the end. And that's obviously simply not the case. So how has the experience been trying to get the message through to communities that men also can be abused? They can be abused by women, and that men should feel comfortable stepping forward and saying, "Hey, I'm being treated in a way that is not acceptable."
Yeah. Hagar works mostly with children, so boys. We do work with other organizations that work specifically with men as well. It is hard. When I first was in Cambodia, I remember we had a case of a boy, actually a couple of boys, who had been abused. And it was by their local religious leader. And it was a huge issue for a multitude of reasons, not only because they were boys who had been abused, but they were boys who had been abused and they're bringing accusations against a religious leader, which in Cambodia then brings ramifications about the afterlife. And that's very hard to come by. It's why some of our shelters back in those days needed to be in secure locations where people didn't know where the survivors were being kept. It has come to a point, I think, from seeing the government take stances on these things, of saying that they saw the abuse, and unfortunately some of those boys had to tell their story far too many times, and in far too much detail, um, to be able to be listened to and accepted. And I think that the Cambodia, the Vietnam of today stands on the shoulders of those boys, men who were brave enough to tell their story so many times and then go through months and months of trauma counseling to get to a place where they felt comfortable. We also have there in Cambodia specifically, there are so many men that are now counselors and case managers, not only in Hagar, but in many of the NGOs that work in the trauma, abuse, and anti-trafficking sector, that have come through Hagar's care, have come through the care of organizations like ours that are advocates themselves. So sometimes it takes one who then is willing to stand up for others and continue to say, this is what happened to me. This is something that is a problem, and this is why. And I am now old enough to tell you my story and feel strong enough to share it multiple times now, about what happened to me when I was young. So I think that has shifted. But you will still find, of course, people who don't believe that it's real. It's an ingrained societal feeling. I just think it's not quite as normal anymore.
Okay. I mean, at least we can say that there's improvement in that direction. Um, but so that this is fine for the Southeast Asia space, but one that stood out to me when we're looking at the list of countries where you operate is Afghanistan, and that's yeah. I imagine Afghanistan would be a completely different kettle of fish. That it would be significantly more oppositional, especially now with the Taliban back in power. Um, the systematic disempowerment of women, like I would go so far as to say the abuse of women by the state. Um, is Hagar able to actually achieve anything in the Afghan space?
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a big question. Um, Hagar has been working in Afghanistan since 2008. So back in 2006, we did this long research study into where where's the need. So sometimes I get asked, like, why are you in Afghanistan? Why are you doing work there? And the fact of the matter is, we had external research look into all of the different places in the world that were having issues in trafficking and abuse, where Hagar's specific skill set could be used, and countries that were open at that time to people coming in. And I say now, a country like Afghanistan or Myanmar might not have made the list as it did back in 2006, 2007. But we opened up an office in Afghanistan in 2008. It was with Department of State from the US funding for a boys' shelter for boys that had gone through Bacha Bazi. And we still have that shelter open today. And it is by the government at that point and by the current government blessed, because the Quran speaks out against that type of abuse. Whether or not that abuse happens within any of those governments is a different kettle of fish, but it is something that they vocalize as a problem. So there has always been acceptance on the national and international stage for that shelter. And we've been able to, our team there is phenomenal and has been able to do sort of that very interesting work of making sure that we are able to continue our work with women, with girls that have suffered extreme abuse, and help the communities to be able to be resilient, so that it just looks a little bit different today than it did 5 years ago in Afghanistan. But we've been there since 2008 and have seen, ups and downs. We've been in countries in turmoil before, and I think Hagar is the kind of organization that one of our mottos is whatever it takes for as long as it takes. And we just firmly believe that as long as we are welcome to continue some work in the country, we will stay.
And just for the audience who might not be familiar, Bacha Bazi is a type, effectively you're pimping out young boys dressed as girls. Anyone who's seen the movie Kite Runner would have sort of seen a representation of this. It's quite endemic in Afghanistan, unfortunately. But so it sounds like your focus in Afghanistan is more on child victims of abuse and less so on attempting to bring some sort of justice and legal protection for adult women. Is that correct?
That is correct. It is not currently an option in Afghanistan. So we focus where we can.
Yes. Okay. So it's obviously you would like to, but you just recognize that the door is not open for that right now.
That's right. We do focus on on that in Cambodia. We, to a lesser degree, in Vietnam, and in specifically in our work in Thailand, we do a lot of legal work as well. But in Afghanistan, that's not an option at the moment.
It's really unfortunate to hear. And Thailand, again, would be quite a different context because, of course, Thailand, land of contradictions, which I don't know, every country in Southeast Asia seems to get the moniker land of contradictions. But Thailand, on the one hand, it notionally has a very sex positive culture, but compared with the other countries in Southeast Asia, on the other hand, prostitution is notionally illegal, but on the third hand, prostitution is very much intrinsic to getting that tourist dollar. And yeah, the sex industry in Thailand, it's it's not great. From my understanding, a lot of the women that you would see in Bangkok in these bars are actually impoverished women from Isan province in the northeast who may have families back home, they may have children back home, and they've had to come to Bangkok and they've had to work in the sex industry in order to make ends meet. So it's not, the sex industry doesn't exist, as far as I understand, as a result of Thailand's very sex positive culture. It exists as a result of economic hardship and the willingness of foreign tourists, or the ignorance of foreign tourists, towards the exploitation of people facing economic hardship. So what is Hagar's focus like in Thailand?
Yeah, that's a really good overview of what's going on in Thailand. In our work in Thailand is in Chiang Mai, mostly. And working in Thailand, you have to have the blessing of the Royal Thai Police, and you have to continue to get that. So we work specifically with the government, with the police, on bringing down trafficking and online child exploitation and sexual abuse. So with children specifically, it is a lot trickier. I know organizations that do work sort of in the red light district or with adult women, but it is harder. And it's not something that we have moved into at the moment. We work with children, so we're minors, on getting the information needed for prosecution for crimes. So it's pretty specific, that it's more of making sure that a, a child or a minor who has been a victim is able to get the what they need. And so we do, all of our other work as well, but it's really working with the police to make sure they have what they need to get the conviction, so that the minor can get reparations or as much money as possible from the perpetrator. And so it's very different, and it's a little trickier to work in. We also have a significant portion of our survivors that are in Cambodia that were trafficked to Thailand for, sometimes begging, sometimes sex work, just sort of depends. Sometimes labor, and sometimes labor trafficking and sex trafficking get sort of mixed together because there can be one and the same. If you've been trafficked to be a maid, but actually then you're sold for sex by the person that's purchased that, it's all just sort of runs together. So it is an interesting country to be working in, and it's newer for us. We've only been doing work in there for a couple of years in Thailand.
Okay, it's good to know. So on this trafficking, like, this is the big issue, isn't it? Like, you operate in Vietnam, you operate in Cambodia, you operate in Myanmar now, you operate in a bunch of different countries, but of course, in no country is the situation isolated, because the trafficking means that problems in one country and problems in another country are sort of interwoven, right? It's a continent-wide tapestry. And I notice you're not operating in mainland China, correct?
That's correct.
And yet in Myanmar, we have this very messed up situation, as you know, where the numbers vary, but the current estimates that I was given by USIP are something in the vicinity of about 120,000 people have been trafficked for the purposes of working the scam centers, and most of those victims are Chinese. So I'm just wondering, and I imagine that there will be a lot of Chinese victims throughout Southeast Asia. Is there a reason that you don't operate in China? Does the Chinese government not want external assistance with this problem, or what's the go?
China was one of the countries in that assessment. All countries were. North Korea was in the assessment, but of course we're not welcome. Our work, the reason for not being in China, I'm not sure the exact reasons why China was not chosen, but it is far more difficult to operate within mainland China as a foreign INGO. It's also you have to have a country that's willing to have the help as well. And so therefore we have not seen that as an option as of yet. I mean, I won't say that that's a never piece, but you are absolutely right in that China is both a destination and a
source
for trafficking on both sides. You know, there are people trafficked into Myanmar, into scam centers from China, from all over Southeast Asia as well. There are women from Vietnam and Cambodia and Thailand trafficked into China as brides for men that either cannot have a child, so it's less of bride trafficking and more of just trafficking to have a child by a servant, or by men that don't have a wife, and then vice versa. There are women that are trafficked out of China into all of these other countries for labor and for sex. So it is much more interconnected. It's hard to say, but I will say that I don't know the exact reasons why we didn't move into China. I could guess that it's because it wasn't an easier place to move into.
That makes sense. So then, looking at the Myanmar space, I understand that your work does not focus on the scam centers because they're quite remote and very heavily guarded. It's a little bit outside of your remit. So what does your work in Myanmar focus on?
Yeah, so we started our work in Myanmar years ago, but for the last 5 years, we've been focused really on capacity building of a couple of different local organizations. So we work with one that's been there for over 100 years that has little pockets of their group all over Myanmar, so they're able to be in all of the provinces. So we've done capacity building and trauma informed care. We had a researcher come up with, in Burmese, our trauma informed care sort of package to go and then train NGOs there. And then we did it online training. So it's really trying to get, for the organizations that are operating on the ground in Myanmar, getting them the training needed to understand what trauma is, understand how to work with a traumatized individual in all sorts of casework, but then specifically what is trauma counseling. And for the last couple of years, we've been working on this project where we had local Burmese that were saying, we've gotten all of this trauma informed care training, but we don't actually know how to sit down with an individual and have that first sentence, because how do you start the conversation? And then where do you go from there? We understand what trauma is and how to interact with a person when they're going to the doctor or interact with a person who's going to school. But how do you actually sit down and have the conversation to work through some of this trauma? And so our team from Vietnam has gone over multiple times and has done online trainings as well to get, at this point, 2 counselors certified in trauma focused therapy to be able to then take that further out into other provinces. The goal is really to get in a country that has such widespread trauma. It's not just about trafficking and abuse, but just in general, there's such widespread trauma in Myanmar that having counselors who understand how to work a person through the trauma to a place where they can live their life without having that trauma affect their day-to-day lifestyle is so needed. And so that's sort of the next 5 years is the goal is to then take that to other provinces in Myanmar. So we've done 2 provinces so far.
Mm. And so, so this is a phrase that you've used throughout this interview, trauma-informed care. And I wonder if you can sort of jump a little bit into what that phrase actually means and how it's distinguished from other sort of previous types of care and approaches to people who have suffered trauma.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know I sometimes use terminology that like we use in the work that we do, and I don't always stop to think that not everybody understands that. So trauma-informed care, when we first started doing the work, it was just that wasn't even a phrase. It's just you bring a woman who's been victimized into your care, and then you do whatever she needs in order to get her to a place where she can live on her own. And then over the years, through research, just really realizing there are ways that we would interact as humans that someone who has gone through severe abuse, their brain chemistry has been altered. And, a soldier has PTSD. The same thing happens to people who've suffered extreme forms of abuse. And so there's this whole way of thinking now. It's sort of that like wraparound care of looking at an individual and the care that they're getting and seeing, okay, a person who's gone through this sort of abuse at school or in a workplace might have a harder time paying attention. And so it's treating that person differently in that situation because the difficulty paying attention is because of the trauma. So while they're going through, sometimes 3 months, sometimes 6 months of counseling, intensive counseling to work through some of this cognitive behavioral therapies, different therapy techniques for a person to be able to deal with that sort of trauma on their own and work through it, that all of the care needs to be influenced by the fact that this person has experienced severe trauma. That's not just going to the doctor for physical traumas, but it's also that sort of emotional, psychosocial trauma. And any person, so our foster care families go through trainings as well, because you're going to have a person come into your care who gets angry more often, or might be sad and not speak for a long time. And instead of our human reaction is to feel offended or frustrated at that and want those behaviors sort of fixed or changed, that it's a result of trauma, and to let the healing happen so that person can move through it instead of, sort of adding on shame or frustration on that person.
Because that just sounds to me like what we would consider to be trained psychology and therapy, really, is this understanding that, well, okay, the person that I'm dealing with and the behaviors being exhibited by this person are two fundamentally different things. And we can work through those layers gradually and gently at that person's own pace so that we can, open up and get down to the person at the core of it and help sort of rehabilitate them from from those experiences. But again, I imagine that in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, yes, obviously they have modern medicine and all that, but mental health does seem to lag a little bit more in developing countries. Is it difficult to find qualified psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists in these countries who are able to deal with the particular needs that are presented by patients with PTSD? What's the go? Do you have to bring in Western trained therapists? Do you have just upskilling for local therapists, or are you trying to work with the establishment to try to say, hey, like at university when you're training your psychologist, you should probably, you know, have a focus on this? Like what's the extent to trying to improve mental health support services?
Yeah, all of the above. So when we first started, there was no psychology, sociology, no counseling degree in Cambodia. And in fact, we were instrumental in helping get the first people going through the counseling in and the psychology degree in Cambodia. So now, today, there are trained psychologists in Cambodia, and what we do is upskill from Western, bringing in sort of that ongoing training. But it has taken years. So we've had probably about 10 years of individuals that have gone through government or university training in psychology, sociology, counseling in Cambodia. So it exists now, and I'd say mental health is becoming a little bit more understood in Cambodia when it comes to therapy. But then it's the understanding of every other person that has a touch point with that person, that it's not just during counseling that that person is going to be acting differently, but it's, in all other areas of their life. And so it's this sort of longer stretch. But as far as trained counselors, it is now. I would say we have some great trained counselors, some that have been trained Western. But when it started, we had foreign people that would come in that helped with some of the writing of those trainings and manuals. The first training that we did in Cambodia was something that Johns Hopkins helped us with, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that they helped to make specifically for Cambodia, or TFCBT for short. And then we did trainings on for our staff, and then all of the other NGO staff that were in Phnom Penh. So that was only 12 years ago. So now they have it in university level where you get trained on that sort of thing. So it has come a long way, but as always, there's always ongoing training that needs to be done.
Interesting. And so I want to look at sort of the more broad thing. So my understanding is you have three basic stages that you operate in, right? You're focused on prevention, you're focused on restoration, you're focused on reintegration. And I understand you don't focus on extractions. I presume it's because you don't actually have the muscle, and you have to keep yourselves very legally clean as an INGO. But what is the sort of thinking or the rationale of saying we're not going to get involved in actually taking people out of these situations? We're just going to focus on post-extraction care. What's the thinking with that?
Yeah, that's a lot of different reasons. I would say that it's not to say that we never get involved in an extraction. We have a hotline that is used for survivors who have come through our care and have been reintegrated. It's also for people who've gone through our prevention programs, and for anybody who's living in foster care. So any person that has a touch point with Hagar can call our hotline at any point. We have had people call, and we have been involved in extractions multiple times. It's not our first point because of a few reasons. One, we partner with other NGOs that is their whole model, is just extracting. And it is sort of a different thought process of just the kicking down doors or working with police force. And we focus on that, like that care and the long reach after that point. But at the same time, in some ways, it's because we are able then to work with the government on a different level. We don't have the same frustrations, working with scam center survivors. We're able to just work with the survivors and not get into sort of the political scene of what it could look like trying to be involved in extracting from those situations. So we're able to keep ourselves also sort of apolitical in that as well, which has been really helpful in allowing us to have good government relations in all of the countries where we work.
Yeah, I imagine that would help. So we've spoken about the preventative elements of it. We've spoken about, hotlines and information and things like that. But can you explain what you mean by restoration? Because that to me, that rings of restorative justice. Is that what you're talking about? Are you talking about like legal consequences for the perpetrators of these crimes, or what is the restoration for you?
Yeah, so we use restoration sort of as a catch-all for aftercare, for what does it look like for a person to get from extraction to feeling like they can live a full life. But that oftentimes does mean restorative justice, and working with legal teams and legal aids. It is a large part of most of our work. For each person that comes through, we have lawyers on staff. We also work with other organizations that do prosecution. But seeing some sort of closure for each person is really important. When years ago, there was a case of a man from the United States that had come over and had abused about a few different boys, and they were going through their restorative justice piece in Cambodia. But then, in order for them to feel like real closure and feel like they could move on with their lives, we ended up supporting them to come to the United States to give testimony against him in his case in the US as well, which went a long way in him going away to prison in the United States. But then that sort of gave the closure that they needed in order to feel fully at peace moving on and feel like they had could stand proud and feel like they had taken power back from the abuser. So that, I think, for that restoration is the restoration of each individual person's power, and that depends on the person. Some people don't feel like they need that, but for a large majority of, we call them clients, but individuals who come through our care, that is sort of needed or wanted in order to feel like they've regained their own personal power.
Mm. And I wonder, like, how much power do you have here? Because if we're talking about the United States, I mean, I imagine an organization like yours would have a name that is recognized in certain sort of human rights and special victim sort of circles within the legal system. And I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult for you to find, lawyers. But in a lot of these other countries, the legal systems can be much trickier to navigate. It can be much harder to get convictions. It can be much harder to move forward with prosecutions. And I mean, I think if you molest children in the United States system, as far as I understand, that's a crime, and so you will be prosecuted by the state. You don't have to find a private prosecutor who will prosecute on behalf of the victim. It's not a civil case. But I could imagine that in the different legal systems where you operate, this might not always be the same. So do you have certain legal firms that you work with, or do you have a recognized legal standing within these various countries' legal systems so that you yourselves are able to go in and advocate? Or how do you navigate the complexities of the political pressures within different legal systems, and also just the differences between different legal systems?
It's tough, it depends on the country, and it depends on the year sometimes, and it depends what we're talking about, and which province we're talking about, and if the judge has gotten the right training. So Hagar looks at those things. We have legal support, and there are law firms, international law firms, who help us pro bono with research on some of these, like what are the laws, where can we interject ourselves. We're able to really look into those things. Linklaters is one of the firms that helps us, or gives us a lot of pro bono work there. We have foreign legal aid that is able to look at sort of the broader scope of where we can go and what we can do in all of the countries. And then we do also have legal support in each country, in our countries, to advocate for an individual. We don't do the prosecution, but what we do, for instance, in Cambodia, it's taken forever, but we've come up with training. We've come up with with all of the training to then train judges to tell them exactly what the law says already for child rights, for people who are going through the system specifically for trafficking, but for any sort of abuse. And it's things like not having to ride in a tuk-tuk with the accused abuser. It's, which seems like it would be really well known, but if that's been the norm in your province for forever, until you have it in front of your face and you've gotten the training, it's hard to know that that's not something you should do. Or that you could have a screen put up so that when a child's trying to testify, he or she doesn't have to see the person, in a small courtroom. We say courtroom, and I think everybody thinks of like the TV shows. And when we say courtroom, it's like the size of a room in your house. It's small. Um, and it can be long days, and it can be everybody knows you, and so we've done judges training, and that training will then go into university trainings so that it becomes the norm that people understand, so that all of the provinces know, so that survivors or victims going through the court system will then not have to deal with those same sorts of hardships. So those are the sorts of things that we look at there, but it takes lawyers that are on our staff, it takes other NGOs, and it takes law firms giving pro bono support as well.
So, I mean, there's a lot there, and it's difficult because it sounds very much like it is a civil prosecution almost. Like you would assume and you would hope that in a case where you say like, hey, there's this dude and he's going around and he's abusing children, you would assume or hope that the process is, I'm going to collect evidence, I'm going to walk into the police station, provide the evidence to them, and then they are going to, make the case. They're going to arrest the person. They're going to hand that over to the public prosecutor. The public prosecutor is going to prosecute, and that's the end of it. Like the bus drives itself. But it sounds very much from what you're saying that in a lot of these countries, it is a much more hands-on process, and that, of course, I assume is going to put a much greater emotional strain on the victims, who would have a much higher burden placed on them to demonstrate that they are in fact victims, and would be subject to far more difficult circumstances throughout that prosecution. Are you running into problems where people just don't want to go through that process?
Yeah, I think it can be hard, and it's up to the individual, but it is a long process, and it can be tough to want to go through that. Um, we have phenomenal counselors who have these sorts of conversations with the individuals, but we'll have an individual who feels, sometimes the perpetrators or the person who's sold a person for sex is a friend or someone that they knew for a while and considered a friend. And so sometimes there can be this interesting sense of feeling bad for bringing it forward as well. And that's hard. So we have these conversations where our counselors have these conversations, and our case managers do. And our legal team really just talks about what the rights are of each of our survivors. And then it's up to the survivor if they want to go through the whole process. But you're right, it's not really like the bus drives itself. You have to push for it, and then we have to push the government to move forward with it. And they're long processes, like if we were to have, it depends on if it's a foreign perpetrator as well. So, if it's someone from the United States or from a different country, then you get other things like the government of that country involved as well. And that then is a whole nother story. And then it does sort of drive itself in that it has to happen. But it does still require such emotional toll from the survivor of the abuse that it does have to be something that is something that they feel they need in order to move forward. And oftentimes it just can be hard to get to that point because it feels daunting or like a big task at first.
Mm. Yeah, it seems that everything gets stacked against victims as they try to navigate this. This is, I even remember, like, I believe it was Jermaine Greer who a few years ago was advocating that here in the West, rape should be treated as a civil offense, not a criminal offense, for the simple reason that the burden of proof in criminal prosecutions is so absurdly high, and the nature of rape being what it is very, very difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it happened. And so it would actually be potentially less oppositional to victims to say, you only have to prove 50% plus one likelihood that this person did something that they shouldn't have done. And the penalties may be less severe, but at the very least, you have a chance of getting some sort of justice. Whereas, in the system that currently exists, your success rate is actually statistically quite low. And we're talking about very much the 21st century in the West. So yeah, it's we can't exactly say it's good anywhere.
And I don't disagree with her. I think, you'd get more what we call reparations or monetary benefit for a survivor if it was not a criminal case. And I think that's unfortunate that that's the sort of world that we still live in.
But yeah, the only issue I have with that is there's that sort of comment, punishable by fine means legal for a price.
Yeah.
And we don't want to send that message to people.
Oh, that's a really good one because it's sort of like people weigh the consequences, and prison time or behind bars is a big penalty. And if you're willing to pay a certain amount, are you willing to pay the fine that would take as well if it's just punishable by reparations? So that's That's a
because I've been I've been in a I won't say which country, but I was in a country, um, and in a certain establishment, and there was a sign on the wall that sort of said, a warning to all tourists, like the penalty for drug possession in this country is a fine of this much. And I was with my friend, and I pulled out the calculator and I worked out how much that is in USD, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, I can cover that. We're good. And that was that. Like the attitude was like, okay, we're safe. I think we're pretty safe. And it really was a case of, okay, it's legal for a price.
mm-hmm.
And that's on the one hand, because yeah, the locals, they couldn't pay that money. They had no hope of paying that money. But they're also not the people engaged in recreational drug use in that country. It is very much the tourists who are doing it. And all these signs are basically just saying, if you've got a moderate amount in your bank account, even if the police shake you down, you're fine. And that's really just kind of perpetrating the system. And that, I think that kind of leads to the other question, because the laws themselves can be the obstacle here, because when you're doing all this work, you go out into these communities, you try to tell them like, hey, you can't do this, right? You can't treat people this way. You can't treat your wife this way. You can't treat children this way. You can't do this. You can't do that. And the people might understand, oh, okay, well, what we were doing was wrong. And hopefully they're open to that. But laws change very slowly. The legal infrastructure is quite difficult to move in the majority of cases. Do you find a circumstance where you've gotten a community to recognize that, hey, what happened to me was wrong, and I want to complain about the mistreatment that I suffered, and then you go and you realize that in the legal system, actually what happened to you is not punishable in this jurisdiction?
Mm. Yeah, I, I I am certain that happens. The types of cases that Hagar specifically takes on are what we call the most extreme forms. So we'll take on, the individual that other organizations will say is maybe a little bit too difficult or might be take too long or a harder case. Um, Whereas but I will say in our community work, there, the mindset may shift, and yet it still wouldn't be legally wrong to do some of the abuse perpetrated by men to women. Wouldn't be legally seen as wrong, or would be seen as like strange to bring forward as abuse. Um, and I think we sort of focus on the abuse that comes out, the more extreme abuse that comes out of those vulnerable situations of people not understanding that even these smaller forms of abuse, if you want to call them that, are also wrong.
Mm. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, you're kind of trying to like balance on both ends there,
Yeah.
in a sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose there would be a reinforcement in a way, like when if you're in a community and you kind of notice like, oh, wow, that dude's going to jail for what he
Mhm.
did, that I suppose that would filter down and be like, at least it reminds you, like, that there are consequences for mistreatment, like, and that makes you realize, okay, maybe the things that I do are not as bad, but
Mm.
it kind of switches something, and you would realize, oh, okay, we are not in playtime anymore. Like, real things happen to real people as a result of this. Maybe I should reconsider my actions, hopefully.
Yeah, and I do think that that does happen a little bit. It's the reason why you don't hear as often about foreign perpetrators in Cambodia specifically, because there was a time period of really cracking down
Mm,
on individuals that were living in rural communities, and then perpetrating horrific abuse
mm,
within the communities. And then people would see um, that was being crimes were being convicted in Cambodia and then being they were having to pay large sums of money, but really then being taken back to their home country and then going to prison or going to jail, like having hard repercussions. And I think it doesn't change the fact that the abuse happens, it just sort of sends it underground, which you could argue is not any better, but at least it's not seen as mainstream acceptance of the abuse. So I do think that there are some of those that are happening in some of the communities, but I agree with you. I think the more that it happens and people get hard repercussions, the more it will give people pause. But it does mean that, there are other countries that we'll probably need to be talking about, because while it gets harder in Cambodia, it's still easy in the Solomon Islands. So there's sort of this shifting of patterns of
Yeah.
ease of abuse.
Yeah. Like the industry exists. Like Cambodia came down, but the Philippines, still a target. Brazil, still a target. Like the industry exists, the money is there, and unscrupulous people are always going to find that opportunity.
Yes. And I mean, I think my own personal thing that I would love to see one day is some really good research on how do you get a broker or a person who, is that in between person of selling someone. How do you figure out how to change their mindset? How do you stop a broker from wanting to sell people? I don't know if that's possible, but that's the thing in my head that I would love to see happen one day.
I'm sure that can be done. I think research has been done with regards to what here in Australia is referred to as the people smugglers. So
Yes.
largely, they're moving people that we would consider to be legitimate refugees, but international law does not give that status to for various reasons. So I have significantly less condemnation, although they do engage in very, very, very scummy, exploitative, abusive practices. But at the core of it, at least, these are people where you could like, okay, I want to sit down, I want to have a conversation with you, and understand how this whole process works, because at the end of the day, that there is a hint of altruism in it. It's like at least you're helping someone get out of a war zone.
Oh,
You're
sure.
just you're just doing it in a really bad way, but at the very least, there is that. Yeah. So I know a couple of them have been interviewed. The Australian government did try to do some work on that. So I imagine that with human traffickers, that would also exist.
There is some. It's hard to find from someone who is actively engaged in it. You can
Mhm.
sometimes find someone who's in prison for brokering human
Yeah.
trafficking, but So it's just, I think, until we get to the point where we can sort of stop the desire and the need or perceived need, it's the demand for it will continue to be there, and it's just trying to figure out how to make it as difficult as possible and as unappealing as possible,
Yeah.
while also restoring the lives of those who have gone through it.
Because that's the thing that you're talking about is need. I was talking to someone. She was writing an article on these on the scam centers. And what she was actually investigating was someone within Myanmar who was planning to go to the scam centers voluntarily and
Mm.
work there because, I mean, like there's a war going on, right? And you don't have a lot of options. And the scam centers, like we know that those places are horrific, but if you're going voluntarily, you're not treated quite as badly, and the
Mm.
potential to make money is there. And this is the thing. I would imagine, this is pure conjecture, that human traffickers who have some semblance of a conscience, and some of them definitely do not have a semblance of a conscience. That's absolutely clear. But those who do, I would imagine that in their mind, what they're saying is, this is the best bet that people have. I saw an interview with one of the guys who in Afghanistan whose job it is to find little boys for Bacha Bazi,
Mm-hmm.
and he was kind of like he sort of saw himself as a model scout almost, of like, oh yeah, I go down to playgrounds and
Yeah.
I walk up, I give them my card and da da. But the way that he presented it, even though he was predatorily targeting the poorest boys from the poorest communities, the way he presented it was like, well, I'm giving them an opportunity to make money. I'm giving them an opportunity to enter into business. I'm giving them a chance in a world where otherwise they would be forgotten. And I can imagine that as long as we face extremes of poverty and lack of access, there is always going to be that angle of, well, it may be shady, it may be questionably legal, it may be this, it may be that, but your alternative is dying of starvation. So I'm kind of giving you a way out and just taking a little bit off the top. And I suppose for a lot of people that's enough for you to be able to go to bed at night.
Yeah.
But I'm conjecturing, obviously.
No, that's I think you're probably not wrong. I mean, that's me conjecturing as well, but
Mm.
it makes sense. Everybody's got to figure out how to go to sleep at night, and you're not going to do it by saying that being evil is okay. You have to
Yeah.
figure out how you feel like you are doing some sort of good. That's
Yeah.
interesting there. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And so, and this is I want to word this question carefully because I don't want to sound like I'm making excuses.
Mm.
But you're working in Cambodia. We obviously saw the genocide there, Khmer Rouge, terrible. Vietnam went through warfare from, I mean, I think officially they started resisting the French back in 1947, and that didn't end until 1975. Myanmar has gone through, consistent internal conflict. So you're working in a lot of country, Afghanistan, obviously, that are war torn.
Mm.
Would we say that the existence of conflict, not in a sense that there's availability, there's conflict, there's no law enforcement, I can do what I want, but rather in the sense that an entire community, a society has been traumatized and has suffered extremely. Is there a connection that says people respond to this, the trauma of conflict, by becoming abusive within their much smaller knit communities, whether it's their immediate family, the spouse, or people around them? Is there a causal link? Does abuse exist partially as a result of crisis in the country?
That's great. I mean, I think abuse happens everywhere.
Yeah.
It happens in Australia, in the United States. It happens all over the world. And I do think that, though, in these countries that have widespread trauma, widespread war or conflict, that what it lacks is any safeguards against it. And so while the abuse happens everywhere, in other countries, there are some safeguards around individuals. And there are systems in place to help individuals that have suffered abuse. And there are repercussions for those who perpetrate the abuse. And when you're in conflict, the repercussions don't exist at the same level because people are concerned about their own safety. So they're not really concerned about their neighbor being abused. And the systems that are there for individuals get broken down. So I don't know that it exists because of the trauma, but it is a factor. I think there's, the conversation around, like, poverty doesn't cause someone to sell their child into trafficking. Poverty doesn't, trauma doesn't cause that. There are plenty of families and individuals that have gone through these sorts of things, or are impoverished, or have gone through horrific trauma, that would never think about that,
Mm.
uh, about abuse or trafficking or selling a child. And yet, it's this sort of pressure cooker that, if all of the other things are already there, can sort of push forward, like either looking past red flags and just hoping that everything's okay, or can sort of push the needle on a situation that was already not great.
Mm.
And so abuse can happen as a result of trauma, in a situation where it was a family that sort of had a predisposition towards abuse already.
Interesting. Interesting. And then this is the thing that we haven't spoken about yet, which is the reintegration component when someone has faced that type of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
What do they? I mean, what do they need? Like one hand, we've spoken about the restorative justice, but how does a person like that reintegrate? I assume it's more than just sending them to therapy. Like if you've been abducted, or if you're an orphan, in a lot of these cases, I imagine it's not a simple matter of returning this person to their support network, to their family, and not just emotional support network, but in a very real sense, because you're working with children, financial support network.
Yeah.
What does the reintegration process look like?
Gosh, it's so individualized, and it's evolved so much. When we first started, I think we thought that getting an individual up to speed with education and going through some counseling and then sending them back home would be enough. And very quickly, through our own work, realized that you can bring up an individual's level of resiliency, but you have to bring up the communities and their families' individual resiliency as well, so that it doesn't happen again. So it's working with the family members that they're going back to, doing counseling and case management, making sure that there's um, someone in the household that has access to income. But it's also working with the individual, whatever is needed. Oftentimes it's healthcare, very basically saying, getting the person papers. A lot, if the person has come from, say, China, she might not have a passport, she might not have a birth certificate, any sort of legal documentation. So it's getting that legal documentation to prove that she's who she said she is, and so that she can live and have a job and vote and all of the things that you need to do within society. And then it's working to get skills, and the ability to hold down a job. Then it's working in the community to make sure that it's safe to go back, that the community understands that it's not her fault, and that there's a level of acceptance there before reintegration. It takes a while, and Hagar works with each individual after reintegration with checkups for 2 years after, in order to just make sure that they're, because things can come up. We just want to make sure that each person that is reintegrated doesn't fall into the same traps that got them there in the first place.
Mm. So it sounds like it's a very multi-step, multi-layered process to get someone up and running. And like even just that reminder that even if that person can overcome their trauma, even if their perpetrator can be punished, the community stigma can still exist and can still be a barrier to reintegration and reentry. That's that's just a terribly depressing thought of like, you've done nothing wrong, you've been hurt by someone else, and you may have to carry that mark for the rest of your life in the eyes of the people who are never going to view you as an equal anymore.
Yeah, it is. And I think, for a while, we thought that the resiliency of the individual was enough, but really understanding that for many people in communities, they think that an individual is going off to another country to make money, and then that person comes back without any money and with this significant trauma and knowing that they've been abused. And so there's working through first just understanding, like, no, this person didn't come back without money because she spent it all. She never got any money. And in fact, doesn't even have her passport or any sort of identification anymore. And then working through with what that means. But that's hard for the communities to process and takes time. So so multifaceted in order to really get to a point where a person feels that their life has been restored and they can move forward in a better place than when they left.
Absolutely. And so probably the final thing that I want to ask about is your work back in Myanmar again, but specifically because you've been working in Myanmar. I think you've been working through YKWBA, but you've been working in Myanmar for about 10 years now. Has the coup, have you noticed anything after the coup? Have instances gone up? I imagine it's phenomenally difficult to do any restorative work in the current circumstance. And phenomenally difficult to do any work in the current circumstance, to be honest. But is your life in Myanmar being made much more difficult as a result of the conflict? Is there more abuse happening? Or is it that at the very least the trafficking is not as severe because everyone's sort of on lockdown, everyone's fighting for their lives, you're not running these large complicated networks of sex trafficking? What has the transition and the change been like since the coup?
Yeah, that's great question. We had planned on opening up sort of a Hagar like we have in other countries in Myanmar for years. And sort of working through that process, and the coup has changed some of those thought processes. But we've always been working through YKWBA, and it has absolutely shifted things. This last project through the UN was after the coup, and it has been difficult to work, but only because YKWBA has such deep roots and have so many people throughout Myanmar. We're able to do a lot of work. I think trafficking never goes away; it just goes underground. So what we have seen is that you might not have these extensive networks of sort of a brothel, but you do still see it happen, whether it's by motorbike to a person's house or selling to a person's home as sort of a maid, and definitely a lot more domestic abuse and violence within the home. And so there's the work on economic empowerment to bring up some level of livelihood funding to sort of reduce the risk and vulnerabilities in some of these communities. So it is extremely difficult to move and work within the country. It's difficult to move money around, even just to get the project's funding in. But it is, I would say, from my time knowing about our work in Myanmar, it is more necessary now than, it's hard to say it's more necessary, but it is just as necessary now as it has ever been. We're starting another 5 years of very slowly moving things into other provinces. There's not the ability to sort of jump around, but I think that slow work in each province, I do think that sort of work of changing the mindset of one community at a time, it takes a really long time, but working in Myanmar after the coup has forced that. And I would almost venture to say that we're able to change a community's mindset better because we're not trying to work in 7 to 12 different places all at once. We can really only work in 1 or 2 places at a time.
I mean, yeah, the challenges must be frustrating, if nothing else. Yeah, just knowing that there are so many things where you can't do
Yeah.
anything. You can't fix it.
It's hard to see the need and know that you can't do anything about it.
Yes. Yes.
Especially when you know if you could get someone, then you could do something about it. And having to sort of sit with that frustration is really difficult. And it really helps us to be able to say what we've always said, which is focusing on that one individual in front of us. Um, and if you focus on one person at a time, then when you sort of step back over the 30 years, you're surprised by how many lives have been impacted.
I mean, absolutely. But I think, I don't know. I think we've all experienced the agony of powerlessness
Mm-hmm.
in not necessarily powerlessness in our lives, but the inability to do something about injustice that you can see. Like, yeah, especially in Southeast Asia. Like, I loved living in Myanmar. I really did. But you see injustice everywhere, and you know that, like, the chips are stacked against you, the law is stacked against you. The society is not going to be on your side if you come in and do something. I mean, you know, like, just seeing, like, domestic abuse, even in Yangon and in the surrounds, it's just a part of life there. And like, going through in your head consciously that, like, there is no way for you as a Westerner to intervene and come out of this situation on top. It is
Yeah.
not going to happen. And it's frustrating,
Mm-hmm.
it's painful. So I just don't know what it would be like for you guys actually having a much clearer picture of just how bad the situation is, and having to make those decisions of saying, this is not a case, this is not a direction, this is not a location where we're able to go.
Yeah.
I don't know, that it must be very difficult to
It,
deal
it
with that.
it is tough. It is very hard. I think that's where all that we can do is focus on the individuals that we can work
Yeah.
with and know that, each individual then causes that ripple in their own community. And so it's that focus on each person. Because otherwise you look at the whole and it becomes overwhelming and depressing.
Absolutely, yeah. I can understand that. So yeah, I think we've looked at a lot of different things today, and I really want to thank you for the expertise that you bring, because these are not fun topics. These are not, uplifting topics. Nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody enjoys this, but it has to be spoken about. It's necessary that it be spoken about. It's necessary that it be understood, that it is complex, that it is multifaceted, that it is unique in each instance, and it is, at the very least, comforting to know that you and organizations like Hagar are out there and are trying to advocate and are succeeding in this advocation. So I really want to thank you for the work that you do, and also for the time that you've shared with us today. But we always end our episodes in the same way, and that is inviting our guests to share any direct message to the audience, anything that you would want them to know, anything that you want them to think about. If there is anything that you would like to say directly to our audience, I would invite you to do that now.
I appreciate that. For anyone listening, I would just say, Hagar and organizations like us, we've worked in Cambodia and surrounding countries for 30 years. We focus on the one individual, and our goal is to see each individual life changed to move into restoration. If you want to know more about Hagar, you can find us. It's hagarinternational.org is where you can find more information about Hagar, or support the work if you'd like to. But I just want to thank every person who's listened, and thank you for having me on. I think it's an important topic that we don't get to talk about as often as we'd like. It's so nuanced, and but every person can make a difference in the lives of individuals in countries where it feels like you can't. It's through things like the people that work at Hagar that have conversations with these survivors every day to bring them to restorative justice.
Many of you are quite familiar with our nonprofit, Better Burma, which was formed in the weeks following the military coup and carries out humanitarian missions around the country. But did you know that we also have a shop that carries handicrafts sourced from artisan communities throughout Myanmar? We take great pride in all of our products being 100% Myanmar made, from the materials to the design to the workmanship. From the thanaka artfully incorporated on the dolls' faces to the cats and frogs wearing scarves made of traditional Lungji fabric, they all clearly show they were made in the Golden Land. So your gift will bring a little bit of authentic Myanmar into the home of its recipient, and even if just a little, will help keep the people and culture alive in our hearts. And most importantly, your purchase will not only support the livelihood of the artisans, but also help fund our wider humanitarian and media missions. Please take a moment to visit our shop at alokacrafts.com. That's Aloka, A-L-O-K-A, crafts, C-R-A-F-T-S, one word, .com. Of course, as is your preference, you can also consider making a donation through our normal channels. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Hoba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam